to the theme of our convention, our keynote speaker, owner and editor of the Malheur Enterprise and Salem Reporter, publisher Les Zaitz, two-time Pulitzer finalist. He's an Oregon native. He and Peggy have been having this great conversation about Eastern Oregon. It's been so much fun. Let's see, he started his professional journalism career right out of high school, hired in 1973, same year I graduated, as a general assignment reporter for the Salem Statesman Journal. He continued writing as a staff reporter and correspondent while attending the University of Oregon Go Ducks, working for the Springfield News, the Oregon Journal, UPI, and the New York Times. Good name dropping. His family bought the Malheur Enterprise in 2015 to rescue it from closure. This is what we were talking about today, midday. And Zaitz assumed the duties of publisher after retiring in October 2016. The newspaper since then has won state, regional, and national journalism awards. The newspaper has had partnerships with ProPublica, Report for America, and Solutions Journalism Network to deepen the enterprise's reporting in its rural community. The newspaper also hosts Interns Go Youth, that's a smooth move, sponsored in part by the University of Oregon and the International Society of Weekly Newspaper Editors. Les has won state, regional, and national journalism awards from more than 40 years. In 2007, he was part of a team that won the prestigious National George Polk Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer in 2014. He is a 5-time solo winner of Oregon's Bruce Baer Award, the state's top award for investigative reporting. The Oregon Newspaper Award, not given since 2010. In 2020, he was named a Society of Professional Journalists Fellow, the highest honor of the National Society of Professional Journalists. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Zaitz.
Do you want the stand or hold candle?
Sorry.
Was that taller?
Go for it.
You're pretty tall. You're quite the man. Okay, good. There we go.
We have work to do, you and I. Think about what's going on in the country and here in our beloved Oregon. People are discouraged, they are divided, and they are disbelieving. There are many reasons we find ourselves in the circumstances we are in this country and in Oregon. But I think one of the fundamental ones is that we have watched an erosion of trust. Too many people don't trust leaders in government, in politics, in business. People don't trust institutions, from the FBI to the DEQ. And of course, people increasingly do not trust the media. That lack of trust in the media holds some of the blame for the lack of trust in our institutions and our leaders. Faith in the media, as you all, I'm sure, are aware, has been diminishing decade after decade after decade across the country. At this point in our history, more people do not believe mainstream media than do believe it. Getting at the truth, then, is harder than ever. At the national level, you have CNN versus Fox. You have the New York Times versus the New York Post. And at all levels in national media, you have commentators posing as journalists. On top of that, you have public officials who have become very adept at making the press the boogeyman of today's social, economic, and business ills. They discourage people in the press from asking them questions by deflecting the attention to the press. And increasingly, they work to dissuade you, your friends, your neighbors, and your colleagues to not believe what you hear. That what people said, they didn't say. What they wrote, they didn't write. I think the press holds significant responsibility for these circumstances. We're at fault. We're at fault because of our historic, frankly, arrogance. For too many years, we decided what you should know. We made those choices for you. We got too cozy with the people that we liked, and we made it pretty apparent who we didn't like. We set aside our journalistic objectivity in ways that impair our trust and erode our ability to do our jobs. Just as important, in the years that I've been in this business, we have been too slow to admit our own faults. We have not admitted our errors. We have not admitted our mistakes. We have not admitted, honestly, our own missteps. As a result of these factors, people, of course, are turning increasingly to other sources of information. I don't need to tell anybody in this room about the potency of social media today. Facebook, TikTok, you name it. Too many Americans believe what they see on those sites is the truth and reflects the reality of life in America and in Oregon. And you know that's not true. Right now, we face actually a new threat, in my view. Artificial intelligence is emerging rapidly across industries, including in journalism. Just recently, I saw a stunning example of this when artificial intelligence produced a completely believable photograph of Donald Trump in handcuffs in New York. Well, you may laugh, but it was false. But here's the point. Many people believed it was true. And they were ready to react based on essentially a cartoon. That should worry every one of you deeply. As people turn to social media, as the faith in media diminishes, one element that is filling the vacuum in Oregon, in many of our communities here in Oregon and across the country, is government. Government increasingly has very sophisticated websites. They have become increasingly powerful users of social media themselves to put out the government message. Now, that's essential if you want to know where a wildfire is headed, or if a freeway is closed, or if you need to find out how to get a permit to put a well on your property. But I ask you this, when's the last time you saw on a government website or a social media post the government saying, we made a mistake? Now, you know, just as in the press, the government makes lots of mistakes. The point is that you are getting a colored view of government from government. They have become very sophisticated at hiring not only communication specialists, but social media specialists and public relations specialists. They know how to message in a way to get their favorable points across and to bury the news they don't want you to hear. So why is any of this a problem? Simple. Our collective ability to solve problems. is weakened. Citizens, voters, are discouraged from participating in the election process, in their own government, and in forums like this. Too many people say, what's the point? Take a look at the most recent election, the special elections, where we made critical choices on school board seats across this state. 300 and some seats were up. I challenge you to find any news organization outside of a major metro area that reported anything about a candidate for school board other than name, rank, and serial number. In community after community, whether it's Grants Pass, Klamath Falls, Burns, Hepner, voters could not turn to an independent press to find out about the people who want to run their school system.
I accept your challenge. Sisters.
But there is another example of what happens when the press isn't paying attention, and therefore you're not paying attention. In Eastern Oregon, earlier this year, entire school boards resigned. Why did they do that? They resigned because they didn't want to comply with new ethics requirements voted in by the legislature that made school board members no different than a city councilman or your planning commissioner who has to file a basic statement of economic interest, which is intended to keep our government clean of corruption. If you went on the website of any of those school boards or those school districts, you would not find a word about those resignations, not one. Now, in this era, when an entire school board resigns, isn't that something that parents would want to know or should know? Isn't that something that the people who are writing property tax checks should know about? At the Malheur Enterprise in Vail, we stumbled upon it by accident because no one had said anything. And a local teacher just mentioned to one of our reporters, well, we don't know where we're headed because the school board's gone. What? Like they're on a field trip? No, they all quit. So we were able to report to our community that these school board members all resigned to avoid complying with the ethics law. But the circumstances in Malheur County frankly got even worse because they figured out that what they could do is resign, miss the deadline for filing, and then get reappointed to their seat and not miss a beat. Now, what kind of lesson does that teach the children of Malheur County about responsibility, about obedience to the law, even to laws you don't like? Imagine if every one of us evaded compliance with the law simply because we just didn't think it should apply to us. The state would be a wreck. But the point is, people don't have that information in most communities, and when they went to vote for school board members, they had no idea that that incumbent had sidestepped ethics violations. Now, maybe the candidate is such a wonderful participant in the school board that would have been reelected anyway, but that was pretty material information that a voter should have had before casting their ballots for the school board positions. All of this is really about you and the work that you do here, and those of us still standing in the press, is finding ways to get information to people that they can trust. Because facts define the problem. And they help frame the choices to solve those problems. But if we don't agree as a community in Eugene, as county residents in Josephine County, as residents of Oregon, if we can't agree on what the facts of the situation are, our conversation devolves into an argument about what is true and not true, and the energy needed to solve critical problems in Oregon gets dissipated by those arguments. That's not good for any of us. Really what we need is more people to trust those facts and to put that energy into solutions. I think a lot about the performance of the press, and history is instructive to me, because we've been here before. In the 1880s, New York City, two very powerful publishers went at it in a very competitive way, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. They became enormously successful as newspaper publishers in New York City. And the way they did it was two things. Number one, they charged just a penny for their papers, but more importantly, they loaded up their papers with scandal, with sex crimes, with gotcha stories. In other words, they loaded up their papers with what today would be called clickbait. Their circulation soared. Well, this seemed to be what people in New York wanted. They didn't want real news. They wanted this salacious stuff that they could talk about on their ride to work. But as that newspaper war was underway, a newspaper publisher from Tennessee showed up in New York, looked around, and he bought a daily newspaper that was about ready to go out of business. He believed that there were enough people in New York who, in fact, wanted the truth and wanted real news, that he could make a go of it in New York in the shadow of these two towering giants. He bought the failing paper, and he promised people that he was just going to deliver the news and let them act on that news. In the coming years, Joseph Pulitzer's paper went out of business. William Randolph Hearst's paper went out of business. And that small publisher from Tennessee stood on top of American journalism, for he had acquired the New York Times. Now, the lesson to me, and I've read the biography of Adolph Ochs countless times in the years that I've been in this business, is a reminder to me of that core principle and a faith in the goodness of the American people, that they tired of that salaciousness and they realized what was happening to their community, to their city, because they didn't know what was going on. And I think that we are in that place in America today, where people, maybe not quite yet, maybe not this year, not next year, but I think the American people are going to tire of the type of news peddled by Fox and Newsmax and News One. And people are going to realize that they have not been told the truth, and they're paying a price for that. That lesson I put to the test when my family bought the Malheur enterprise. The enterprise was founded in 1909, a standard, typical community weekly. When we acquired it, it was about ready to go out of business. The publisher was so desperate to get rid of it that he advertised that he would take a pickup truck and trade for the keys to the office. The paper was filled with press releases on the page one, whatever a government sent in or an organization sent in, reprinted without a change, filled with high school sports. When we came in, we stripped that formula out and we did what we thought a community newspaper should do, which is to report on what his government is doing and hold people in power accountable for how they're using their power and the public's money. That didn't go over very well. This is a community and a county where public officials, whether it was the county commissioners, the mayor of Ontario, the police chief, and NISA, all have operated for years, if not decades, with no one questioning what they did, how they did it, where the money was going. We started asking those questions. We did make a lot of friends. I'll give you one example of that, and you may have heard of this. We had an economic development director, a man by the name of Greg Smith, who's a state legislator out of Hefner, who's made a small fortune in obtaining contracts with local governments to provide quote-unquote services. Part of this unspoken part of the contracts, we believe, is that you hire me and I'll make sure that you get state money. Because Greg Smith had something those people did not have. He held a powerful seat on the State Ways and Means Committee. He had a lot to say with where your money went when it left the Capitol building. They launched a project in Malheur County to build a publicly funded rail shipping center. We thought from the start, this is great, good for agriculture. Malheur County is one of the poorest counties in the state. It needs all the help it can get. A $26 million gift from the state was supposed to fund and get that thing running. That was 5 years ago. The questions started emerging pretty quickly. The project fell behind schedule. Accounts of how it was being built and who was getting the contracts were going unanswered. So Mr. Smith, who started out being quite friendly to us, I'll never forget him coming in soon after I bought the paper and sat down in my office and clapped his hands together and big smile and says, Les, I'm gonna help you all I can and I'm gonna keep you in the loop on what's going on. Terrific. It wasn't long before he stopped granting interviews. He would not respond to written questions about this project. At one point, he triggered a criminal investigation of the newspaper because we dared to send emails to his staff on the weekends. Well, I gotta tell you though, that sounds ridiculous. But this is a rural county, very high in law enforcement. Mr. Smith had a considerable power, and I can tell you it sent a shudder through our little tiny newsroom that we might be subject to a criminal investigation, that we would have no idea where it was going. We didn't know if we should be waiting for police to show up with search warrants. We didn't know if we were going to all have to get attorneys. It panicked us, frankly, because it was uncharted territory. Fortunately, the sheriff, Brian Wolf, who's a great friend of the Second Amendment, also proved to be a great friend of the First Amendment. And Sheriff Wolf shut that down in like 36 hours and said, this is ridiculous, there's no crime here. But the point is, you had a public official trying to intimidate the press away from getting at the truth about how public money and public power is being used. He didn't stop there. He literally kicked us out of the news conference that he was holding for news organizations in Eastern Oregon, and we would call in, and Mr. Smith would say, you're not welcome, and disconnect us. We would call back in, and he finally blocked our number from a public news conference about a project that we knew more about than any of those reporters that had been invited. we relied on public records to try and dig out the truth. And we were quite successful, frankly, in part because the local district attorney, time after time, issued orders that we sought requiring project leaders to turn over records. And then we discovered that records were being destroyed. But we kept going in the face of intimidation, obstruction, delay. The county judge, the county chairman in Eastern Oregon, publicly criticized us. The members of the development company board publicly criticized us and attacked our reporting. But they never once, not once, in 4 years could identify a single factual error. Now, this is a deep red community. Malheur County went for Donald Trump 76% in the last election. You would think in a community like this that it would be pretty easy for Republican leaders to rally their citizens against the press. But this is another lesson that we learned at the Malheur Enterprise. The people in our community wanted the truth. They knew they were being lied to. Mr. Smith, last year, in one of his fits, made the mistake of sending me an email suggesting that he buy the Malheur Enterprise. Said, I'll write you a check, I'm not going to take your staff. And I laughed it off for a minute, and I thought, well, wait a minute. I wonder if the community is tired of our work, and I can finally retire. So I took his offer to our community. Okay, community, Greg Smith would like to buy the Malheur Enterprise. What say you? And I'm going to be honest with you. If I had 80% of our community saying, sell out, okay, Greg, here's the address, mail the check, here's the keys. The response was remarkable. Hour after hour for days. We got emails, we got calls, we got letters. 3 points. Tell Greg Smith to go pound sand. Don't you dare sell, and keep going. Keep going. There's an incredibly valuable lesson, not only for the Malheur Enterprise, but for all of my colleagues in this profession who feel so beat down by today's environment of distrust. What this showed me is what Adolf Ock showed New York City in the 1880s. That most people, most sensible, reasonable people, regardless of their politics, are hungry to know the truth about their own community. They want to know where their tax money is going, and they want to know if someone's misusing that tax money. Because every one of you work very hard for what you have, and none of you want to tolerate public officials who use your money like monopoly money, which is what has been going on here. What this tells me, frankly, is it's not too late for my profession to turn these circumstances around. That facts do matter, and that they will triumph over duplicity. That's why next month I celebrate, or observe, celebrate's not the best word, my 50th anniversary in this profession. I stay at this because this erosion in trust, the erosion in our ability to get the truth, is a problem not only for journalism, but it's a problem for the people of Malheur County. It's a problem for the beloved state of Oregon, and it is a problem for our country. So where do we go from here? How do we use the lessons we've learned at Vail to the benefit not only of journalism, but to the state of Oregon and to your communities? Well, first of all, my profession has some reckoning to do. I talked about our arrogance. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, I have friends all across this country who are hard-working, diligent journalists. They don't want to get it wrong. They don't want to put their fingers on the scale. They want to just do a good job for you. But as we listen to the tales of how newspapers and radio stations are closing or they're downsizing, Regina Lawrence, I'm sure, did a marvelous job of explaining that circumstance to you today. Within my profession, what I've been trying to preach is, okay, maybe you don't have 10 reporters in it anymore, but you do have 5. Make the very best use of those 5 reporters that you can. And that's a problem in our profession. And let me explain, if I may, just a diversion, a bit about what happens when newsrooms compress or go away, and where we are today with the internal challenges we have to serve you. Number one, because of the fewer jobs, it is harder and harder to recruit people to come into our profession. We are all hungry for new talent. The new talent that does come in is green and untrained. They need a lot of guidance, no matter what their ideals and no matter what their energy level is. We're dealing with a journalistic workforce that is much younger than it has been and much more inexperienced. On top of that, one of the ways organizations, particularly corporate structures, have dealt with this shift in the economics of journalism is we've removed more and more editors from the process. You might better understand that as mid-level management. There's a problem with that. That means not only do we have young journalists, but we don't have editors that can help teach them, train them, and guide them to become excellent journalists. So we have internal reckoning to do, and that's one reason I stay at this, and I do a fair amount of coaching, because it is so important that if we ever are going to regain the trust of the American people, which I think is our primary duty as journalists, we need to train young reporters in the ideals and standards to start with. But when we talk about news studies, in most studies what we talk about is the disappearance of the community newspaper, right? Well, most of you are of a generation where you grew up probably holding the physical newspaper that came in that little yellow box out by the mailbox or on the front porch. Those days are over. But that doesn't mean the days are over of delivering news. Websites, web technology is opening up enormous opportunities for journalists to start up news organizations without having to invest millions of dollars in the steel needed for a press, without having to put on incredibly complex delivery systems to get that newspaper to a front porch. We have tremendous technical advantages these days to be able to replace newspapers with those sort of digital resources. And I can tell you, going back to Malheur County, when I acquired the paper, it did not have a Facebook page, it did not have a website, and the only way you could read the paper was through the print. We have created a pretty robust website, and I can tell you that today in rural Malheur County, we have more people paying more for our digital subscription than they do for the print. Again, that goes completely contrary to the accepted wisdom in the newspaper industry today. I say that not as a sort of a brag, but we've used the enterprise as a place to experiment, and the experiment shows that there are ways to deliver news without putting that newspaper on the front porch. The other thing that I think we need to be much better about as a profession is being more transparent about how we do our work, right? I think for decades, journalists just assumed that you knew that they were trying to get the facts. They just assumed that you knew that they were checking to see that their facts were right. They assumed that you knew they had ideals to live by. Those were faulty assumptions, I believe. We never told you how we did our work, or why we did it, or what principles guided us in that work. That's part of the erosion of the trust. You fear what you don't know. You don't trust what you don't know. So in the profession, we have to get much, much better at being open with you about how we do our job, and as I said earlier, about owning up to mistakes and fixing them without question, without quibble. Now, you can make a difference in all of this, each and every one of you. How? Well, when you find a news trust that you trust, a news source that you trust, well, first of all, subscribe to it, donate to it. Because if you don't provide that support, that news source is likely to weaken and disappear. And then when you do find a news source that you trust, share that with the people that you know. If you're looking for news in Springfield or Corvallis or Coos Bay, here's where I go for the news. Because your opinion is far more valuable to your friends and relatives and coworkers than any marketing literature I would ever dream of. And share, when you do find a news source, share that you trust it. Be explicit about that. Again, be transparent. Because the more that you support your local news organization, the more that organization is likely to survive, number one. Number two, as we've seen in Malheur County, frankly, it is sort of an emotional charge to our take. Hey, the people are with us, let's keep doing what we're doing and do more. All this, the work of journalists, your work here in the league, really is about how do we get citizens more engaged in the issues and the policies and the politics of the day. I have one observation about that. Well, I have lots of observations, but I'll just give you one. I think both of us, journalists and activists alike, have to take a much more pragmatic approach of engaging people. I believe the days of simply telling people it's your civic duty to vote might as well be in Swahili. People just don't hear those sorts of generic messages. Telling people that it is their right and duty will fall on deaf ears. What people want to know these days increasingly is, why does any of this matter to me? Trust me, I hear from readers all the time about stories that don't answer that question. Why should I care about this? I think that question is the same for you as you try to promote issues and engagement, is to remember that people in this day and age are very transactional, and they want to know what's in it for me. That's not being selfish. Life is very complex these days. People have to triage their daily lives. They don't have the luxury of thinking great philosophical thoughts. They're making choices hour by hour how to use their time. And if what you're asking them to do does not produce a clear result, you've wasted your time and I've wasted my ink. I think we need to tell people more clearly, how does this issue, how does your involvement, how does it help? How does it help you? How does it help your family? And how does it help your community? How will it make their lives better? Being pragmatic. But in the face of all the challenges that you and I face today, with the divisiveness, the political rhetoric, and the fighting that seems to go on and on without end, there's one step that you and I have to take, and that is to not give up. If we surrender to the incivility of today, we get what comes. I'm not ready to accept that. What about you? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just a second.